The Republic of Singapore, a small island city-state located right off the southern tip of Malaysia. Chances are you've heard of the nation, as it has quite a reputation for being one of the smallest countries with one of the most successful economies in all of Asia. However, did you know it fields one of the most technologically centric armed forces in all of the region? Putting an emphasis on constantly evolving and keeping its forces up to date with the latest and greatest, for the last few decades the SAF, or Singapore Armed Forces, has seen numerous changes to their weaponry, vehicles, equipment, uniforms, and, in the case of this video, camouflage patterns. Now, we should preface this by saying we usually don't format videos like this too often. That is, covering a country's entire history of a specific item, in this case camouflage. The only other times would be our videos that covered Rhodesia and Zimbabwe. But being that Singapore has had a relatively short history as far as official camouflage usage, mixed with the fact that their identification system somewhat tethers most of them together, it just seems to be the most practical approach. So to start, let's talk briefly about the origin of Singapore, its armed forces, and overall geography, all of which have played important roles in the development of their uniforms and camouflage design. Consisting of 64 islands of various sizes located directly south of what is now the peninsula region of Malaysia, the country of Singapore was released from British control in 1959, however didn't gain full independence until 1963. From there they joined the country of Malaysia, but because of a number of differences pertaining to political, economic, and social policies, were kicked out in 1965, which led them to becoming a fully independent nation. However, during this time, its military force was made up of mainly British and other foreign members that was supported by the British Armed Forces as well as Commonwealth troops of New Zealand and Australia. The British had been asked to stay by the first Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew as a way to maintain stability while the nation got on its feet as far as government and forming a new armed forces go. It was around this time the first camouflage pattern began to be seen in the form of a helmet cover used primarily by infantry units. The design is very reminiscent of spot, or duck hunter camouflage that had been used quite frequently around Southeast Asia during the 1960s and 70s. Though there is no exact origin of the pattern, some have speculated it was based on one of the designs from neighboring countries, specifically that of South Vietnam, which had fielded a very similar one referred to as baobab or leopard during the Vietnam War. This cover continued to be seen up until 1976 or so, when Singapore saw a massive change in its armed forces. At this point, British and Commonwealth forces, the exception being New Zealand, had withdrawn a substantial number of troops from the country, which was caused by two main factors. The first was signs of de-escalation in the surrounding areas of Indonesia and Malaysia, both of which had seen fighting on large scales in the decades prior. However, the primary reason was a shift in British defense spending as well as foreign policy, which caused the withdrawal of most forces east of the Suez Canal. This essentially left Singapore needing to reassess and bolster not only its economy, but their defensive capability and military as a whole, as both had been heavily reliant on the United Kingdom. Here is where things kind of get more into strategy and protocols, which is its own story, but in short, what came out of it was the armed forces essentially adopted an ideal of primarily being a defensive force, capable of protecting not only its borders, but also neighboring allies if need be. This was so much so they actually turned to the IDF, or Israeli Defense Force, granted in a very covert manner for training, structure, and even procurement of certain arms and equipment. This will come into play a little later on. Now, during this time, a vast majority of troops were wearing solid green combat fatigues known as Temasek green uniforms, with camouflage only being seen on small secondary pieces like helmet covers. Though these aren't technically a camouflage design, let's quickly look at them as they play a large part not only in the SAF, but also its camouflage development as a whole. There were two primary cuts, the first of which was introduced in September of 1967, effectively replacing the last remnants of British-provided or influenced uniforms. This cut saw only 2 chest pockets on the shirt and 3, that being 2 standard waist and 1 cargo on the pants, both of which were made up of a heavier cotton. After years of use and numerous temperature and moisture-related issues due to the cotton, such as poor ventilation and heat rash, these uniforms were updated in November of 1979 with the second cut. The main changes seen in this version were the green shade being altered, the jacket's cut updated to one that was closer to the US OG 107 third pattern jungle fatigues, in that the pockets doubled in number while slanting the chest one slightly and increasing the number and overall size of cargo pockets on the pants. Most importantly though was a switch to a lighter, more breathable fabric. Finally, regarding the name, Temasek has a few potential origins but can be traced back to an early settlement found on Singapore and is speculated to have originated either from King Maharaja Tan Ma Sa No Ho of the Buddhist Empire of Sri Vijaya, which influenced much of the area from the mid-600s through the late 1300s, or from the Malay word Temasek, which can mean lake, sea, or place surrounded by the sea. Either way, the Temasek green remains standard issue until roughly 1983 as a field uniform, but also for everyday wear for forces while tending to duties in places like barracks, offices, and so on. So where does the first camouflage pattern come into play? Well, the exact nature of this design remains somewhat elusive, but based on a few factors may have tied into the assistance and training provided by Israel. The story goes that then Defense Minister Dr. Goh Keng Swee mentioned how they believed Israel was the only nation that could help Singapore build a force suitable for their needs. This sentiment was backed up by the fact that Singapore was, much like Israel, surrounded by countries that not only recently saw a lot of turmoil and conflict, but also ones that many residents feared could directly turn hostile because of recent events. And so in late 1965, Israel started to help revamp the new armed forces by advising and training them, as well as supplying certain equipment, weaponry, and vehicles, one of the most significant being surplus AMX-13 tanks. At some point along the line, though, special forces began to take shape, which led to the need to adopt specialty equipment, gear, and uniforms, specifically ones with a camouflage print on them. Now, an interesting tidbit here is that much of the 281 square miles, or 728 square kilometers, that makes up Singapore has been urbanized, thus validating the country's status as a city-state. However, this sprawling metropolis is considered a garden city, where certain portions are made into public parks and wildlife preserves, along with a general integration of trees and other vegetation throughout. This essentially means that though there is plenty of greenery, there's not a whole lot of dense natural regions such as jungles or wetlands. That in turn leads to the question, why even bother with a camouflage pattern? Well, that lies in their need to be able to deploy to surrounding regions and countries. As Israel was busy training and helping to restructure its forces during the 60s and 70s, a request came in that they teach their soldiers jungle warfare. Not being too familiar with the concept, it was decided to send 2 Singaporean officers to Malaysia to be trained, who would then return and pass on what they learned to the rest of the force. However, upon returning, their tactics, which were evidently derived from British World War II era methods, were a bit outdated and lacking. So, using a mix of trial and error and US Vietnam era combat manuals, forces eventually became knowledgeable and proficient. This then led to the need of the first fully fledged camouflage combat uniform. So a new pattern was adopted, which began being spotted around the mid to late 1970s. Much like the spot pattern, it was first printed on helmet covers and headgear, such as baseball caps and turbans, before becoming a complete uniform around the early 80s, with its public unveiling being seen at the 1982 National Day Parade. Similar to the spot helmet covers, it had no official name, designation, or origin source, which has resulted in many different theories surrounding where it came from and how it was first made. First up is the possible French connection, as the country had fielded forces throughout Southeast Asia since shortly after the end of World War II. While stationed there, many units began being issued a newer French-made design referred to as the lizard pattern that saw a number of deviations, both vertical and horizontally oriented, which in turn led to locally made copies, clones, derivatives, and offshoots such as tiger stripe sprouting up throughout the region in the decades after. Lining this pattern up against these, plus to date it began being seen, and one can argue this was another example of it. However, there has been some conjecture that Israel, be it through official or commercially contracted means, may have had a hand in the design and/or development, which brings us to the second possibility. This theory is derived from a few factors, the primary being Israel's involvement with Singapore around this time as far as helping to structure, train, and somewhat equip the SAF, specifically that of Special Forces units. First seen on a large scale during the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel too had utilized lizard-type camouflage patterns that were of French origin, with some even possibly being locally made in the case of the somewhat mysterious designs seen in photos taken during the 1976 Entebbe raid in Uganda. In addition, the pattern, albeit often in a slightly derivative form, has been encountered on a number of commercial, souvenir, and unofficial items both around Israel and East Asia in the form of things like hats and shirts. Though camouflage patterns have often been copied, the scarceness of this one mixed with the locations and time frame it was seen has left some wondering. On a bit of a side note here, it is also worth mentioning a very similar design appeared in Cyprus during the 1980s, being worn by Navy commando forces. Because of Cyprus's location being relatively close to Israel and the pattern arriving around the same time, some have speculated it too was somehow connected. Regardless of origins and who actually designed it, the pattern quickly gained the common names of lizard and watermelon among forces who wore it. Overall, though, the pattern was primarily used by Special Forces units, most notably the CDO-FN, which is short for the Commando Formation, also known by their nickname of the Red Berets. This was due to them being the most likely to operate out of country and in neighboring regions that often consisted of jungle-heavy terrain. It had two primary variations, one green and one black dominant, which were likely caused by batch and production differences as there were a few different manufacturers. These, along with the standard Temasek green uniforms, continued usage through the 1970s and into the 80s. That changed, though, in 1983 with their first official general issue camouflage pattern, which eventually replaced both. Identified by the garment labels, this design was simply named Camouflage Pattern, but also gained the nomenclature as the No. 4 camouflage uniform. It was comprised of 4 colors: brown, black, dark green, and a light, almost tan green. Design-wise, it appears to be very heavily influenced by the US ERDL pattern, which itself helped lead to the US Woodland design. The reason it's classified as an ERDL derivative versus its much more recognizable and widely used descendant is because of the slightly brighter colors and smaller shapes, which are tailored more for jungle terrains and environments. The reason it's referred to as the No. 4 camouflage uniform isn't because it's the 4th pattern, it would technically be the 2nd, 3rd if you count the spot pattern, but rather because of the uniform cut itself. In the realm of Singaporean uniforms, there are 5 primary dress types across all the branches, which are identified by their straightforward number designations. No. 1 dress is a ceremonial uniform worn for highly important events such as parades and greeting guests and dignitaries. No. 2 dress is reserved for more social events such as galas, parties, and dinners. No. 3 dress is used for clerk and office duties as well as for walking out in public. No. 4 dress, which up until 1983 had been the Temasek green uniforms. Regardless of color or design though, these are used for training and field purposes. And finally, No. 5 dress is one that looks very similar to No. 3, but serves as a less formal version of No. 1, in that it's seen during parades, receptions, and ceremonies where the wearers may be able to walk around and converse. So with this very straightforward identification and naming system, the No. 4 dress, often abbreviated as NO4, became synonymous with camouflage uniforms moving forward. Because of this, the pattern would also be referred to as Type 4, No. 4 combat uniform, and No. 4 camouflage uniform, but officially was still called by the simple name of camouflage pattern. This pattern would remain in use for the next 25 or so years, seeing slight differences in colors during production runs. However, one big change was the pattern generally taking on an overall brighter and more defined appearance through updated dyes, as older ones were prone to faster fading and darkening. Though not the case across the board, as there were a few exceptions which you can see based on the photos, a good way to tell the old from the new is by looking at the cut, as many older darker ones are done in a style similar to the 2nd-gen Temasek uniforms, with the slanted angled pockets, while the newer ones with often the lighter shade was seen on an updated cut, sometimes referred to as enhanced, which featured straight pockets with curved edges. However, regardless of variants, like many of the older patterns fielded across the world, it had some drawbacks that soon became evident and harder to ignore. Much like the ERDL in Woodland, it was effective only in certain conditions and was range dependent as far as its concealment capabilities. It was the most efficient at longer distances, over 330 feet or about 100 meters. However, it suffered greatly below 65 feet or about 20 meters. And so in 2008, a new pattern was unveiled. Simply referred to as Pixelised camouflage pattern, this design jumped Singapore into the emerging digital camouflage community that had begun forming only a few years prior. It was designed and developed through a series of photographs of the most common environments Singaporean forces may find themselves in, taken in numerous lighting conditions and at various distances. These images were then segmented, and the common combinations and colors were identified, with the final step being creating the patterns from the various shapes seen in many of the photographs. The final chosen colors were black, a light brown, and then 2 shades of green, a dark almost forest, and a lighter nearly neon green. Now, many have looked at the pattern and compared it to Woodland Marpat, used by the United States Marine Corps. Though the designs and color schemes are similar, there are 2 major differences to take note of. First is the pattern's shape and overall size. Though the designs are close, they are not exact, with the major difference being the size of the pixels and the designs they make up, both of which are much smaller compared to many of the digital designs seen at the time and even since. The second is the inclusion of the light green. This 4th color, which is sporadically added to the design, is absent in Marpat. Much like the previous ERDL, the colors were similar and optimized to blend more effectively into tropical and jungle locations. Like many other digital patterns, when developed correctly, it allowed for effective concealment at both near and far distances, as the overall design incorporated both micro, or small patterns. The DSTA, or Defense Science and Technology Agency, used the term quivering to describe its effect at short distances, along with macro patterns, which allowed camouflaging from afar. However, if you're familiar with digital camouflage patterns, your reaction to this design might be something along the lines of, as it just seems like another standard temperate or woodland design. But this pattern didn't just signify an update of field and combat camouflage and uniforms, but quickly became one of the most noticeable, when not blending into the terrain that is, and popular symbols of an evolution of the entire Singapore Armed Forces in what is known as the third generation fighting force. This change was brought about by the upgrading of everything from small arms, gear, and weaponry to strategies, vehicles, and technology overall. Though this process had begun in 2004, the camouflage symbolized perhaps the most basic element of this transformation, as it was a piece to be worn by almost every soldier. So what were the first two generations? Well, the first began in the 60s when Singapore gained its independence and formed the SAF. The goal of this generation was to simply establish a defensive entity for Singapore and the area that surrounded it. As far as uniforms go, it saw the evolution of the green Temasek uniforms and the limited issue of the lizard pattern. The second generation began around the early 1980s with the goal of updating and modernizing the force, with the intention of constantly evolving it to keep up with technology as well. This era saw the introduction of the ERDL style pattern and the generalization of camouflage throughout the entire armed forces. This brings us back to the third, which was jump-started after the September 11th terror attacks, but really began in 2004. Its overall goal was to update many elements, but primarily put an emphasis on training and preparing to deal with more unconventional and non-state entity-based threats, as well as implementing future-based technologies. This third generation was deemed complete in June of 2021, with the Ministry of Defense, or MINDEF for short, stating preparations were already underway for the next one. But anyway, back to the digital design. Come 2009, the pattern was well underway in becoming standard issue, but another variant of it began to be seen overseas. This one was created due to Singaporean forces finding themselves becoming more and more a part of the international community and thus being deployed to environments they had never or rarely operated in. Be it for peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, or specialty training, troops started being sent all over the globe. One of the most significant, as far as camouflage patterns go, was the Middle East. Starting around 2007, SAF forces were sent to Afghanistan to take part in Operation Blue Ridge, a mission primarily dedicated to providing support and infrastructure to both the populace and Afghan national security forces. Troops that were among the first deployed were sent over wearing Desert Tiger Stripe camouflage, which were likely commercially sourced by companies such as Tiger Stripe products. To address this, the Pixelised pattern was reworked into an era design utilizing more tans, browns, and gray colors, and was issued to forces stationed in places like Iraq. This variant simply had the word desert added to the front, giving it the name Desert Pixelised Camouflage. Jumping forward a little to 2012, and the digital had fully phased out the older ERDL style, but the transition wasn't done, as another two variants popped up as well. A gray-dominant urban-type design consisting of a light, almost off-white, a dark gray, a gray which almost borders on blue, and finally a very light gray which looks almost close to lavender. Keeping with the general nomenclature of uniforms, it was simply referred to as Pixelised Camouflage Pattern, followed by RSN, which is short for the Republic of Singapore Navy. The other design appears very similar in certain lighting environments and photographs, however the design is much darker, going for an overall grayish blue through the use of four colors: a very light gray, a dark gray with an almost hint of brown, an almost greenish gray, and finally a darker white. This one was made for Air Force personnel primarily operating in non-combat roles and environments, and simply added RSAF, short for Republic of Singapore Air Force, to the end of its designation. First impressions of these two may have many jumping to compare them to patterns with bad reputations, such as the US Army's Universal Camouflage Pattern, or UCP, as well as various blue patterns out there such as China's 07 Oceanic, or the US Navy's Blue Dominant NWUs. However, what stands these apart from those is that the environments, locations, and equipment sailors and airmen would primarily find themselves in or around have been taken into account in a different way. This is best summed up by MINDEF, which stated the following: the color scheme is a better match against the commonly used colors of aircraft, ships, and key installations. This effectively blends the airmen and sailors in their respective operating platforms and enhances their survival by delaying enemy detection time. The Pixelised Pixelised pattern generates micro patterns within macro patterns to reduce detection of personnel, making personnel less obvious as a visual target for hostile forces, while working in an airfield environment, a naval base, or on the exposed decks of a ship. It essentially boils down to the following. Regarding the Navy, the gray dominant pattern is issued and designed to blend into the hulls of a ship as well as the often urban color schemes of docks and naval bases, rather than a blue pattern to match water, which has proven in many other countries to be counterintuitive for a number of reasons. Meanwhile, the Air Force utilizes a bluish-gray, which is intended for use in open areas that may be more exposed to the sky, such as Air Force installations, runways, and hangars, as it not only helps conceal the wearer to the horizon, but can also help identify them as Air Force personnel. And with that, we've pretty much covered all of Singapore's camouflage patterns, which were either officially issued or used in large or noticeable quantities. But before we go, it's worth noting two things. First is that though many patterns replaced others as the officially issued, that didn't mean the older ones were immediately thrown by the wayside. For example, when the ERDL type camo came into play, the Temasek uniforms continued use for a few years after for things like boot camp and training. The same with the transition from ERDL to digital. The second and more interesting is that an effort is made to regulate and recycle the older worn-out camouflage uniforms. Whether it's through incineration or shredding, then recycling the fabric entirely, or literally converting pieces into things like bags and accessories by hand, a conscious effort is made. Before we wrap things up though, let's just lay all the patterns out with their names, the generation they were in, and approximate dates they were used. First up is the spot style pattern seen primarily on helmet covers, which first appeared around the mid-1960s and continued use until about 1976. Next up is the vertical lizard pattern, also known as watermelon by some. This pattern first appeared in 1976 as helmet covers, before being seen on fully fledged uniforms in two variants, a lighter green dominant and a darker black one. These would continue to be worn into the mid-1980s, ultimately being replaced by the next design, which is the simply named camouflage pattern, more frequently referred to as ERDL, which began distribution in 1983, being the first official general issue camo. The first iteration of this design was a bit darker in color, being seen on the older style uniforms until the early 1990s or so, when the second version came out that bumped up the brightness slightly and updated the uniform overall, which continued usage until around 2012. Next up is the Desert Tiger stripe, used on a very small scale, most notably by units in Afghanistan, which was worn from roughly 2007 to 2009. Replacing both of these is the current issued Pixelised camouflage pattern family, consisting of a standard temperate design, an arid desert design, an urban one for the Navy, and a blue dominant one for the Air Force. It's a good assumption that at some point during the era of the 4th generation fighting force, a new camouflage pattern or pattern family will be developed and fielded. But being that their digital pixelated series has only been the officially issued pattern for around 10 years, at least as of this video's publishing, that is still likely a ways off. Either way though, when that happens, we'll be sure to do a follow-up video covering its development and usage. Until then, hopefully you found this video entertaining and enlightening. We'd like to extend a tremendous thanks to Mr. Alvin Lee, a Singapore-based collector of Allied and Axis World War I and II militaria, early Singapore Armed Forces uniforms and accoutrements, as well as military movie props and costumes, who help provide a wealth of information, media, and fact-checking. To check out bits of his collection and stay up to date with what he's up to, you can check out Alvin's Bunker on Facebook and Instagram. Link to both can be found in the description below. If you enjoyed this content, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel, or simply check back soon for more of the history of right here on Uniform History.